So we've been talking all day about corruption, and one of course, the great examples of corruption was the full court press against Donald Trump, almost from the moment he was elected, really even before he took office, and certainly culminating with the 2020 election. I know no one better to talk about than one of the better journalists out there. Mark Hemingway is a senior writer at Real Clear Investigations. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, MTV.com. He's written for just about everybody who matters. He and his wife, Molly Hemingway, have produced a book called Rigged, which you won't be surprised to learn is about the 2020 elections. Mark, it's good to see you. How are you doing?
It's great. I'm glad to be here. That's the book.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
What's the subtitle? I don't have the subtitle in front of me. It's called Rigged.
The subtitle is, I always have trouble remembering the things in order for whatever reason. It's how the media, big tech, and the Democrats seized our elections.
Okay. Well, first of all, let's start with this. One of the most maddening things about the conversation about 2020 is that the Democrats or the left, the media, they're all one big blob. They act as if we invented the idea that elections can be questioned. That nothing could be further from the truth, right?
Yeah, we talk about that in the book. The Democratic Party hasn't unambiguously accepted the election of a Republican president since George H.W. Bush. I mean, both, in 2000 and 2004 and in 2016, there were all formal protests by elected Democrats about the results of the election. And people seem to have forgotten this. Post 2004, there was massive conspiratorial nonsense in the mainstream press about Karl Rove's association with voting machine companies in Ohio and all this other stuff. 2000, obviously, we just went through an election in Virginia where the gubernatorial candidate, Terry McAuliffe, still wouldn't say in the year of our Lord 2021, that George W. Bush won the 2000 election fairly. This is an article of faith among Democrats that the last several Republican presidents elected were elected unfairly, and it's absolutely insane. But the weird thing about it was they ricocheted from 2016, where we had massive Russian interference and Trump was an illegitimate president, saying that for years, to 2020 in the middle of a pandemic where they increased mail-in balloting by tens of millions. The states are doing things like mailing out ballots to literally every single voter address on file, and then they're saying this was the most secure election in history and how dare you question the results.
Now, if you had to pick one thing, I mean, you listed when you were reading off the subtitle of Rigged, you mentioned all these things. If you had to pick one thing that really made this election so insanely unfair, because it really was an unfair election, no matter what you think of the vote count. But before we even talk about that, if you had to list one thing that really was unfair about this election, what would it be?
Yeah, well, we talk extensively about this in the book, although funnily enough, since we published the book, we're getting more and more information on this because conservative groups and Republicans are finally really starting to dig into this. But this thing happened where Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, spent in excess of $400 million in grants that went to local election offices. So Mark Zuckerberg has a foundation with his wife. It's called the Zuckerberg-Chan Foundation. On the board of that foundation is David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager, one of the biggest Democratic data guys out there. And what they did is they decided that they were going to give $400 million in grants to local election offices. Now, bear in mind, this is not a billionaire spending money for campaign donations and, spending it on his preferred candidates. This was directly pumping money into your local nonpartisan election offices, i.e. the people that count the votes. And in this case, what they did is they took these two previously small foundations that were staffed basically by Democratic Party activists that were technically nonpartisan. One is called for the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and the other was called CEIR. I forget what that stands for. But these two little foundations, and they gave them all this money, and they went around the country to states, and they said, look, we'll give you money to your local election offices. Ostensibly, this was for COVID relief stuff. This was supposed to pay for PPE for poll workers and things like that. In reality, what happened is they started dispatching these Democratic activists all over the country to work with local election offices, and there were all these strings attached to receiving this money. from the Zuckerberg Chan Foundation. And pretty soon, these people with these foundations that were handpicked by Zuckerberg were doing things. They were designing ballots. They were translating ballots. They were determining where drop boxes were sent. And, of that $400 million, what we're learning now most dramatically is just how that money was targeted, essentially. So I think the last statistic I saw was that 93% of the Zuckerberg grants went to counties where there was a majority of Democratic voters. And on top of that, the money was heavily concentrated in a handful of swing states. And even within the swing states, it was heavily concentrated in flooding the counties that were most pivotal with that money. So as a result, you end up with these weird disparities. So like Philadelphia got $6.50 in Zuckerberg money for every voter in the area. The adjacent Republican county got something like 50 cents per voter in grant money. The state of Georgia got something like 5 times as much Zuckerberg money as neighboring Florida, even though Florida has twice the population of Georgia. And what happened in the election? Georgia moved 5 points away from Trump, and Florida moved 2 points toward Trump. This was basically them running a Democratic get out the vote operation directly out of your local election offices. And the crazy thing about all this, it was all probably legal. I mean, no one ever thought anyone would do anything this insane. But that's what happened. And the scandal frequently of the election was what was legal.
Yes, that is what's amazing. I mean, consider, I can't believe, I mean, at this point it's ridiculous not to believe it, but I can't believe how far south the media has gone, which, if you go back in the day after Watergate, was priding itself on how wonderful and how it spoke truth to power and all this. The silencing of the Hunter Biden story. I was talking today about this woman, Heidi Plank, who's disappeared in L.A., who's connected to all of the people who are connected to Hunter Biden, and nobody's covering that story either. But this was an actual concerted attempt to keep Hunter Biden's corruption and Joe Biden's possible connection to it out of the press.
Well, look, I don't even know if it's like a possible connection, for instance. I mean, we know that Joe Biden met with Hunter Biden's corrupt Ukrainian business partners at Cafe Milano, this, fancy restaurant in Georgetown. There are all these things out there. If the media were even remotely interested in this, I'm sure there was a lot to learn. There were ways to verify the Hunter Biden laptop story. And people did long before the election took place, but instead they tried to completely black out the story altogether. I mean, it was just absolutely fantastical to imagine that we would ever end up in this place in America. Facebook's spokesman, who, by the way, is a former employee of the Democratic Congressional Campaign employee and worked for Barbara Boxer, immediately announced that they weren't even going to go through the normal farce of a Facebook fact-checking process, and they were immediately curbing the New York Post's stories distribution on their platform. I mean, it was just absolutely outrageous if anyone cares about, holding power to account and freedom of information in this country.
Are these guys working? I mean, it seems to me they've all banned Donald Trump. They all suppressed the Hunter Biden story. Are they working in tandem? Are they on the phone with each other? They don't have to be. They're all just the same person.
I really wish that there was some guy behind the curtain, twirling his mustache and tying the damsel to the railroad tracks. It would be, that kind of corruption is a lot easier to root out. And, we actually say this at one point, I think, explicitly in the book. The reality is it's much harder to wrap your head around the fact that, a lot of this happens simply because it is just sort of like hive mind. Everybody has a specific goal. I mean, if you look at the media, for instance, and you look at what the media does, and you just assume that the media's primary goal is to determine the outcome of the most important national elections in this country, all of a sudden everything the media does starts to make sense.
Yeah.
There's just no way around that. Now, having said that, there was definitely some issues of some sort of suspicious coordination. One of the things we talked about in the article, of course, and raised a lot of eyebrows was earlier this year, there was a story published by this journalist at Time Magazine named Molly Ball, where she talked literally about a, quote, well-funded cabal of, what was basically, those are the words she used, well-funded cabal. It was basically, labor unions, CEOs, and a bunch of Democratic activist groups all coming together to, quote, unquote, fortify the election. That was the word she used, and, quote, control the flow of information, basically. And so there were all these people and powerful forces that were actually on conference calls and things like that, that were doing things like, reassuring the public with various, planted news stories and press conferences and whatnot that mail-in balloting is perfectly safe, even though for, decades everyone has acknowledged the extent that we have mail-in ballots, they're far and away the most susceptible, far and away the most acceptable way of voting to fraud. So, there were all these things there where they were just basically trying to sweep things under the rug and, put their thumb on the scale for sure.
I was on a panel once, a journalistic panel at a high school, and the liberals kept saying, kids, what you really have to do when you read a story is you have to go to the fact checkers. Now, you wrote a wonderful piece for the Daily Wire about fact checking. It's basically at this point, is it fair to call it a scam at this point?
I mean, I think it's worse than a scam. I mean, I would feel better if they were making money off of it. At least have some sort of selfish motivation that I can understand. But the reality is that no, I mean, what they're doing is basically about power. So I've been writing about fact checking for, a decade now. I mean, I wrote a cover story for the Weekly Standard back in the day called Lies, Damned Lies, and Fact Checking. And it was 2011, I think. About this, where I dismantled all this stuff about fact checking. I mean, they've done university studies on this stuff. I mean, it's not rocket science. PolitiFact and these other fact checking organizations will rate Republican claims as false at a rate of 3-1 over Democrats. I mean, there's not even a debate really empirically about whether or not they're harder on Republicans and Democrats. And then if you actually drill into the specific fact checks, it's absolutely outrageous. I mean, they take these things that are true facts, but inconvenient for Democrats. And all you see at the top of the page, you see this big bold letter, picture of a Republican politician, a letter that says, pants on fire in 72-point type. But then you actually read their explanation for why this politician is lying. And it's all just contextual nonsense. It's pettifogging. It's kicking up dust. It's all those other things. Just an inconvenient fact for Democrats. And this has been going on for years, right? It was already a farce. But what really happened in the last couple of years is that the fact checkers joined forces with big tech, or rather big tech sought out them. Basically what happened was, in the wake of the 2016 election, the entire liberal establishment in this country freaked out if Donald Trump was elected. They immediately blamed two villains. The first was Russia. I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down to. And the second was Facebook. Donald Trump got elected in November of 2016. The employees at Facebook immediately revolted against this and said that, this was all a result of disinformation on our platform. And Donald Trump's elected in November. By December of 2016, Facebook announced they have this fact-checking program where they're going to partner with media organizations, and the media organizations are going to do fact checks, and those fact checks are going to be used to censor quote-unquote misinformation on Facebook. And that's as simple as it is. Donald Trump got elected. Facebook decided they were going to start censoring things. But the most outrageous thing is the press went along with this. They were like, okay, we're going to allow Facebook to use us to launder their, misinformation concerns through us. And we're going to leverage our own credibility as media organizations to help Facebook censor this. And I know this because I worked at a publication that was participating in Facebook's fact-checking program. I mean, it was just absolutely outrageous. We had, a 24-year-old fact checker, who was entering, links into the back of Facebook, and Facebook, based on the word of this 24-year-old journalist, diligent that he was killing 80% of the global internet traffic to that story that the one person decided was false.
Wow.
I mean, this is absolute madness.
Yeah. Yeah, and the corruption of the press and going along with it is very dispiriting. Now, one of the things I felt about the aftermath of this election is that Donald Trump was not well served either by his mouthpieces or his mouth in making a lot of elaborate and extraordinary claims about, Hugo Chavez coming back from the dead to rigged machines. Did you come away from this feeling that the final count was at least something like what it should have been?
So that's a really sort of tricky question.
Okay.
I mean, we can't sort of definitively answer these things. And at no point in this book do we ever use the word stolen or anything like that, just because, part of the problem here is, what you can and can't prove, right? But that's the whole part of the gaslighting, right?
Right.
I mean, The whole idea is to create a situation where, you can't prove anything, you have to try and, prove things ex post facto. And it's very complicated and murky. Like I said, it'd be a lot simpler if you could just, go out there and, some guy's got a bunch of ballots in the back of the truck. But the methods for doing this stuff are much more sophisticated. Now, as for what you were saying about Trump not being well served by this, we do talk about this. There was a particular case in Pennsylvania, for instance. What was going on in Pennsylvania was that there were a whole bunch of shenanigans that went on in Pennsylvania, but basically what happened was this. It was that there were Democratic counties that were basically completely disregarding the state's election rules, right? And they were choosing to do things like you weren't supposed to look at ballots before Election Day, but they were like looking at ballots, to see if there were problems with them and sending them back to voters to cure their ballots, is the phrase that people use. So there's like a problem with a mail-in ballot that would normally disqualify it. They would send it back to the voter and say, hey, did you fix this, right? They're not supposed to do that according to state law. So what happened is like Philadelphia and these Democratic places were disregarding the election laws and were, tampering with the ballots before Election Day, whereas the Republican counties were not. They were adhering to the law. And so there was a lawsuit immediately afterward by a couple of sharp lawyers in Pennsylvania. I think there were some Republican lawyers that parachuted around the state, but there was one particular lawyer that was from Philadelphia who was very well versed in these issues over the disparate impact of this. Because what happens when one jurisdiction is abiding by a certain set of ballot rules and the other is not, you're watering down the impact of the votes in the other area, right? And this was a pretty clear-cut case. The judge in the area seemed amenable to it. It was proceeding along nicely, and then Rudy Giuliani parachutes in, does this big bombastic thing and tries to turn this case that was not about actual electoral fraud, it was about disparate impact, into an electoral fraud case, and the whole thing just blew up, and the judge was like, get this out of my courtroom as fast as you can. And the poor Republican lawyers that were actually doing yeoman's work basically were, trying to wash their hands of it as fast as they could, and it all blew up. But it was a chance to actually prove that some shenanigans were going on, and we never got to that point, unfortunately.
Did you look at, some of the things that went on Facebook, on Twitter, like the guys who pulled out a bin of votes, from underneath the table, struck me as the sort of thing that looks worse than it is. Am I wrong about that? There seemed a lot of rumors that went around that were not sustainable.
No.
Yeah.
Actually, I would say it's particularly with the stuff that went down in Georgia with the suitcases full of ballots and things like that. It was actually worse than the media wanted you to believe. Okay. Basically, what happened was there was a bunch of contemporaneous reports that came down that night and that said they were going to stop counting for the night. All right. Like, who does this? It's an election night. Right. It's presidential election, right? And so the Republican election observers and the press and everybody packed up and went home. There's dozens of contemporaneous reports that this happened. And then shortly afterward, they started counting ballots again. Okay. No one has fully explained what the heck was going on there, why they did this. Of course, this was also an incident where another media fact-checking organization parachuted in to say, oh, no, all is calm. There's no reason to be worried here. Never mind that the fact check was, dubious to begin with. And so there was all this gaslighting of this stuff. And again, do I know exactly what happened then? No, but I do know that some serious shenanigan went down where they told everyone to go home and then they started counting ballots again. How do you explain this? How do you not, sound klaxons over that? It's crazy. But, again, there were just all these things like that just totally undermine people's confidence in the system. And they, tended to happen in one particular direction, in very heavily Democratic jurisdictions and urban districts. And it's not a mystery that, all of these things tend to go in one direction at some point.
And very quickly, because I'm out of time, do you think this can get better?
I do. For a couple of reasons. One is just, having gone through the shock of all this, I think that Republicans are going to be much more savvy about this. One of the interesting things that came up in the book, and I was shocked. Somebody's been reporting politics in D.C. for 20 years. I did not know this. The Republican National Committee, not a small organization, mind you, had been barred from doing Election Day organizing activities for about 30 years. Basically, what happened was there was some, New Jersey election that went sideways, and a federal judge ruled against the Republican Party and put them under this consent decree that, forbid them from doing anything. That judge retired, and even after he kept senior status as a judge, he kept this decree from getting Republicans, active in Election Day, this federal decree keeping them from doing it in effect. It took the judge dying. So 2020 was the first election in 30 years the Republican National Committee was actually involved in Election Day organizing activities. Plus, on top of that, all the lawsuits and the shenanigans and the mail-in balloting stuff are ramping up so quickly. It took, they caught Republicans unaware, but I think that they're aware of these issues and the muscle memory and the legal teams and things. Don't get me wrong, they're still going to be at a disadvantage compared to the institutional benefits that Democrats have from partnerships with law firms and stuff. But I think they're going to get on top of it better for the next election.
That's good to hear. The book is called Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. It's by Molly Hemingway, but but I happen to know that Mark Hemingway was a co-author on the book. And Mark, I really appreciate your coming on. It's great talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's an honor, and thanks for having me on.
If you like the great content you get here, and who wouldn't, it is great content, like us and subscribe.